Welcome back to GameSpot's coverage of E3 2019. I'm Michael. It's Timur again, and we got the Double Fine here. We got a double header from Double Fine. That's what I wanted to say because we just had Tim Schafer, but now we got Lee Petty, who's making Rad. Now, Rad is a very different thing from Double Fine's repertoire. It's a top-down roguelike action game. So could you kind of lay out the impetus for going in this direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think, even though we're probably best known for like Psychonauts and Brutal Legend, we've made so many games over the time, and I think, we like to explore kind of different spaces. And one of the things that happens when you develop a lot of linear games is that you can kind of play them once, people get sick of the puzzles when you're developing them. And we're like, well, what if we made something that you could play over and over and over again? And I love the roguelike genre. And so we were kind of wanted to kind of take on, for us, the first time to do a sort of procedurally generated, but try and still retain some of the things we care about, the sense of personality and world building and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, could you kind of lay out the moment-to-moment action for those who may not have seen Rad in action or haven't got hands-on with it yet?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Rad, it's a game set in a post-apocalyptic world. Speaking of doubleheader, we're going to add a second apocalypse. but the core mechanic and the idea is that you play this teenager who's been remade by the town elder to absorb the rads from the world, the toxins, and instead of them sort of defeating your character, you randomly mutate. Right. So as a player plays, you'll see their rad meter, the top fills up, and when it fills up, they mutate, and we always visualize that mutation on the player. And we're sort of challenging the player to adapt their play style to whatever they're given. It's kind of like the heart of what I love about roguelikes is the unexpected drama. So we're saying, well, here's perhaps an imperfect tool for the task at hand. Figure out how to use it.
Yeah, right. How do you approach kind of like making those random adaptations or balancing those random adaptations so they're as advantageous as they are disadvantageous? Because you want to create that drama, right? But so you can't always have something that's more powerful.
Right. Yeah, that's the interesting thing about a game where people are going to be playing a run over and over again is that if they were all, let's say we could make them all perfectly balanced in every situation, you would, I think, have less memorable runs because you don't get those high highs or those low lows. Like some of my favorite moments in roguelikes sometimes are when I have kind of mutations that are broken and I've got 1 health left and I'm kind of limping through the world and I managed to still pull off this amazing thing. The way we approached it is we wanted to make sure that each of the mutations kind of maybe filled a certain playstyle archetype, or genre. So, we might have some that are direct damage that are very easy to use. We might have some that are more crowd control that are kind of harder for people to learn to use. But once you they all have their way of being used more effectively than the others. And they have this really obvious use, but they also have hidden uses that we don't tell the player. And so the more you play, the more you kind of figure out what some of those hidden benefits are of the mutations as well.
So you're talking about mutations. When I got hands-on with it, I got to experience some of that stuff, and it really changes the moment-to-moment action. But, I mean, roguelikes and kind of isometric action games are sort of an impacted genre. So how do you navigate a space that's so crowded at this point?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the way we approached it was a couple of things. So one was, I knew that we still like some of the stuff that we really like to do at Double Fine, and some of my favorite things to do are kind of create this world that is absurd on some level, but still somehow a little bit believable. So I know that we didn't want to, when we started the project, we didn't want to make just a room-to-room roguelike. There's a lot of those out there, and they're fun, but you don't really have much of a sense of the world. You feel like you're just shut into these little small corridors the whole time. So our first prototype involved trying to create this more open-aired environment as the kind of main playing stage for our game. And so I think that gives it a very different feel. But we also did want to have those choke points where you go in interior. So we kind of have both of those working together. We have an interior procedural system and an exterior. And then we have a town in the game that is a persistent element. So even though that each time you're playing a run, that particular character moves on, dies, or whatnot, the town itself stays around. And there's a lot of characters in the town that kind of have little side quests and story arcs, and you can upgrade your town over time, over mini runs, which can sort of change the way you play the game and, perhaps speed up some of the earlier game later on once you're more experienced.
Right. Yeah, you were talking about story stuff last time I saw Rad with you, and yeah, like you mentioned, a post-apocalypse. But you're channeling this this kind of 80s vibe here, and you were mentioning some of the movies that inspired your views for Rad. Can you speak to that again?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I'm a child of the 80s, and, I was inspired. I remember all that nuclear angst. It's hard to say that inspires you, but, it does. It motivates you to sort of think about things. And I think at the time, Hollywood and comics and other things sort of took a lot of that angst and kind of created this weird, almost alternate fantasy role-playing game genre, that is the apocalypse. And I didn't want to make another post-apocalyptic game where it was like a very desaturated experience that was completely hopeless, that just had humans killing other humans for, a pair of shoes or a can of gas. Like, that's fine. Other people have done that. So I think what we wanted to make was, it was more about exploring this surreal, colorful world. And when we layered the two apocalypses together, one of the reasons we did that was to give us more for the player to dig through, this kind of sedimentary layer of civilizations that were there. So the first apocalypse is inspired by the 80s nuclear angst, and that's where a lot of the visual style keys off some of those early, 80s graphic design and comics and graphic novels, and we kind of started there. But the second apocalypse lets us add, that's a separate civilization known as the Minders, and they came along hundreds of years later and kind of suddenly vanished. But they put all these, you can see on the screen now, we have this underground that was a Minder structure. And they built all these machines and teleportation things. So they kind of bring this strange science fiction layer that, as you progress through the game, it goes from maybe what you'd expect, a kind of deserty looking thing with rundown cars and old buildings, to something more surreal and unexpected.
Right. When we were talking earlier, too, you were saying that the main character is sort of this, is a teenager, youth. It's represented through the player, and then whenever you go back to that hub town and how the story progresses, you have like older folk who are kind of, have a different perspective on the world and the post-apocalypse. So I think that's one of the more interesting aspects that I got out of it, is that you're trying to, at least what I got out of it, is that you're trying to more or less make a statement for like youthful energy, youthful rebellion. Can you expand on that when it comes to the game's story progression?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a couple of themes there. I promised myself I was not going to say everyone hates boomers today. But
you said that in the interview I had with you.
I know. I was like, I can't say that. Mom might be watching. No, but it's it's just the idea that you've got these two previous civilizations that basically just ruined the world twice in different ways. And then you're in this small town, and you're in part of this community, and you kind of volunteer to go out and try and find power for the town because you can exist. But fundamentally, what's happening is they're turning to the youth, they're turning to these young people, and they're like meat to the grinder. You go fix the world. And I kind of feel like that resonates a lot with people right now. And that connects to us visually and mechanically, also through our sort of transformation, which is like as a player character moves through the world, they leave behind a grass trail, and they can and they're basically, there's a mechanic function for that. It lets you know where you've been, speeds up retraversal, but thematically, you're sort of healing the world a bit. You're kind of transforming it into a better place while you're sort of sacrificing your own humanity. The player character becomes something less than human the longer they play. And if you go back to town and talk to people, they acknowledge that you're like helping them, but their dialogue and responses change based on your appearance.
Right. That's funneled through the mutation system, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So that's my next question was going to be like, how do you balance that kind of desire to tell that story, even if it is kind of heavy with some of the core tenets of what Double Fine is known for, which is like almost a light-hearted, humorous quality to your characters and storytelling. How do you put that into a game like this? One that is in a genre that doesn't have a big focus on storytelling. It lets kind of like ambience and a few lines here and there create the kind of outline of the story and lets the player fill it in.
Yeah.
And two, while also tackling those kind of heavy but almost under the surface themes. How do you make that still feel distinctly Double Fine?
Yeah, I mean the way we think about the games is, personality is a term I like to use. So it's not that they all have to be, knee slapping hilarious or anything, but and I think we always look for those moments of personality. And in the case of Rad, we did a couple things that we play with there. So we've got this narrator that kind of announces things as you're playing the game, and this is ostensibly the voice of the elder from town. And we play a lot with the idea that people in the world have imperfect knowledge of the civilizations that came before them. So the elder is sort of a scholar of the 80s, you know, which they call the ancients. But he gets all the information wrong. Of course, a lot of the jokes, you know, as a person are just wrong. And as you're moving through the world, you'll hear his voice as you do various things like pick up meat or currency or pull off mutation combos and things like that. And sometimes he's saying these very kind of ridiculous terms that, you know, are maybe inspired by 80s music and movies and themes. And it's because, you know, he believes those are words of power and evoking them aloud brings you good fortune. But he gets it completely wrong, you know. And we have like lore that you can find through the world, this sort of voice lore of the Elder, kind of telling the backstory of these civilizations. And it gets a little more revealing the more you go on, but it kind of starts off in a very funny, like, this guy clearly did not understand the 80s culture or what, you know, what that would have been or what nuclear Armageddon was. You know, they don't, you know, so we've kind of played with that idea a lot. And then the mutations themselves are, I love things that are both funny and charming and disturbing at the same time, you know? And I, I think, you know, mutation, we kind of played with that idea. So we didn't just want them to be mechanically interesting, but also visually surprising and a little funny. So, you know, for example, we have this mutation called Death Row, R-O-E, where you get a little tail and you lay little eggs, and then these little eggs become little followers, that little spider-type things that follow you around and attack enemies for you. But when we did this prototype of it, and it was fun, but it was kind of missing something, and then we were like, well, what if we made it so that whenever you birthed a spider, it would have your head, like whatever player character. And we did that, and people were like, that's super disturbing. I'm like, yes, that's exactly what we wanted. It's funny, too, because what also happens is if your head changes because of mutations change, we keep changing it on your little spider babies as well. So it just becomes this funny thing to see what weird combos. And it's just there for thematic and cosmetic interest. You know, mechanically, they're still kind of doing the same thing. But
you were talking about the combination of something that's disturbing but also comedic. And I think, if I recall correctly, before Rad, you did Headlander, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of lessons have you learned from Headlander, and how are they kind of channeling into Rad now that you were in charge of that project, and now you're in charge of Rad as well? So what has changed for you since then?
Yeah, I think you know, one of the things that you know, the storytelling in Headlander, we tried to do a little bit more with, you know, cutscenes and a lot of dialogue, but it was such a fast-paced action game with a million lasers on screen that just sort of found that players would kind of just bypass a lot of that story and then kind of maybe feel like they hadn't quite got as much of it as we'd like them to. So I think with Rad, you know, we didn't want to do a bunch of cutscenes. It's a roguelike game, but we really tried to kind of redouble our effort. You can see there's a lore statue we found. We really kind of tried to layer a lot of the stuff in the environment and the dialogue, knowing that the player is going to play many runs, so it would slowly unfold and hopefully intrigue them. And I think if you do a full successful run in Rad, you actually get a story drop. We have these little story sequences that play right at the end, and they give you benefits like mechanical benefits, new bats and characters, but they also start to move this kind of meta arc along that goes across all of your runs. And it's still left a little mysterious. You know, ideally, I'd love for people to go, well, I'm not exactly sure what they meant. Let's kind of debate it or talk about it. I kind of love that, you know, stuff when games and movies do that. So.
I'm really interested in your kind of like, from a development and design perspective, the feeling of moving from projects that are so drastically different. I get the feeling like, is there a sense of like whiplash going from a game, like one game idea to the other, and having, because a lot of developers obviously they work on games and they iterate and they use the learnings of previous games to make a version of that game that's better. But you guys are like an idea factory. You go from one thing to another thing that's drastically different, and from the outsider's perspective, it can almost seem like, oh, you guys are having to start over as developers each time. What's it like to do that? What are the challenges to do that, and is it fulfilling when you do that?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's both really inspiring and challenging to do that, and also it can be frustrating, you know, because you do have to kind of approach a lot of, we go, well, we can't use the same camera system as Headlander, right? That was a side-scroller. Yeah. So we're like, well, okay, we're making a new camera each time. But at the same time, I think because you're not making the same thing over and over, you go through that process where you are exploring and investigating what you think you can kind of bring to this particular genre or game. And I find that super inspiring and challenging, and it keeps you on your toes. You never just assume, oh, well, yeah, we're just going to use the same camera because we've had it before games, and yeah, you know, this is the combat system, the way the skill tree works. You kind of have to, you know, kind of go through all that.
Right. What other games are kind of were you playing when you were kind of thinking of this game and developing it? Are there any key inspiration points? Obviously, the genre is replete with new games and that are similar or have a spin on the roguelike genre. So what were you looking at and being like, oh, this is cool, we should try something like this?
I mean, you know, my favorite roguelike of all time is not that actually close to Rad, you know, which is Spelunky. I really love that game. And it's very, very different from Rad, right? And it's more of a platformer than sort of the action. But I think in that game, one of the things that really inspired was a sense of mystery. You know, you're definitely told some things, but there's a lot of hidden stuff in that game. And that's something that we've tried to incorporate in Rad. So even if you get a mutation, like I mentioned earlier, we tell you the basic way it works. And then there are sort of hidden uses of it. And then we also have combos. So, you know, your character can have multiple mutations at once, and there's additional hidden abilities on some of them when you do button combos and stuff. And so I think games like that, and to some extent Binding of Isaac was also an inspiration. You know, a lot of the earlier roguelikes that I really loved. Both of those have a lot of mystery and discovery, and that's something we traditionally haven't done as much of Double Fine. We tend to, you know, push the story and characterization forward.
Right.
But I think for this, we tried to really challenge ourselves to hold some of it back and let some of it be unexplained. Let the player find some of that. And we've got quite a bit of that in Rad, so I'm pretty excited for people to play that and start finding some of it.
Cool, cool. All right. I mean, that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much. That's Lee Petty from Double Fine, and his game is Rad. You can check that out here at E3 2019. We got it covered, and we got so much more covered, so stick around for the next segment.